Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground. I'm Malva Kajali, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with Nick Tilsen and Krystal Two Bulls from the NDN Collective, a national organization dedicated to building Indigenous power. They'll be in conversation with Ash-Lee Woodard Henderson on the Land Back campaign in the Black Hills in South Dakota. We've got a real triple punch afternoon lined up for you today. So first we'll be viewing a short film that came out just last fall from the NDN Collective, which is the first installment of their Land Back film series. We're also so lucky to have Jordan Brien, who also goes by Mike Jordan, here with us today, who'll be performing a song. And we also have Ashia Ajani here with us today, who will be reading a poem to close today's program. So give it up for them. And before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to honor the memory of all those we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country, as well as to honor those who are working to undo legacies of violence and disinvestment, and acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of this state. Now, to introduce today's conversation with a prayer, I'm so thrilled to hand the mic over to Nick Tilsen. Nick, take it away.
Hamadakiapi, Nick Tilsen, Amachiapi, Chantea Washtenape Chizapolo. I'm going to start off with a prayer, and I want to also acknowledge the ancestors of all the lands that we are calling in from here today. I'm calling in from in my home community of Pine Ridge here in the Oglala Lakota Nation. And I just wanted to say that I think it's important for us to do land acknowledgements every time that we speak, because it prevents the active erasure of Indigenous people. And it's a decolonial way to center our conversations. And so I encourage people, to continue to do that practice. And if you don't know what Indigenous lands we're on, find out. There's a thing called Google. It's pretty easy to find out on there. But I'm going to say the prayer at this time. Hamadakiapi, Hatugashala Atik Wakantaka. Lakowi Chohanki Lay Tunkashala, Wana Kuaka, Wana Kuashte, Wichaku Po Tukashala. I pray that you watch over each and every one of us, Tukashala. You watch over our land, our communities, and our people, Tukashala. I pray for all the people that lost loved ones and the ones that are mourning, Tugashala. I pray for those that are sick. I pray for the kids that don't have no mothers and fathers, Tugashala. And I pray for the elders and the people in the hospitals that nobody can visit at this time, Tugashala. I pray for the people that are suffering in the streets, that don't have homes or food to eat, Tugashala. And I ask that you help them find a way, Tugashala. And I pray, Tugashala, for the pain in which we carry, that we can turn it into healing, so that we can fight for liberation for our land and for our people, Tugashala. And I pray for continued strength for our young people and all the things that our young people are experiencing and going through at this time, Tugashala. I pray for the ancestors for bringing us into this world, and I pray for the generations to come. And I thank you for bringing us together today. Wopila tanka echichiapalo midako yase.
Thank you so much, Nick. And without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to Ash-Lee Woodard Henderson. But before I do that, I'm going to hype her up because she has a killer bio. So Ash-Lee Woodard Henderson is a 35-year-old Afro-Latin woman from the working class, born and raised in Southeast Tennessee. She's the first Black woman to serve as co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center in New Market, Tennessee. As a member of multiple leadership teams in the movement for Black Lives, Ash has thrown down on the Vision for Black Lives and the Breathe Act. She's served on the Governance Council of the Southern Movement Assembly, the Advisory Committee of the National Bailout Collective, and is an active leader of the Frontline. She's a longtime activist who has done work in movements fighting for workers, for reproductive justice, for LGBTQIA+ folks, for environmental justice, and for more. So without further ado, handing it over to you.
Thank you so much. And shout out to Brooklyn Rail for bringing this body of humans together in this virtually sacred space. The most important thing about my bio that is not included is that I am a super groupie about all things NDN Collective and a proud supporter of the Land Back campaign. I'm calling in from Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Yuchi land. And I'm tickled pink to be able to spend time with people who are my beloveds and comrades. But before I introduce some of you to these people who are literally my family, I wanna just give them the mic for 2 seconds, not to talk about themselves, particularly because I'm gonna introduce them formally in a second, but to give some context to a video that we're about to watch. Just a little bit of context from me is that as a Black person who is committing my life to solidarity with my Indigenous kin, I had an opportunity to participate in the Movement for Black Lives Black National Convention. And the only video in the convention that 500,000 people watched that wasn't led by Black folks was a video very similar to this one. If not this one, it's similar to this one. This is the second version of this video, right? This is the second version of this video, but the first version of this video that played during the BNC was the only video that was not by Black people, and it was from the NDN Collective. That's the kind of solidarity that we're building with our kin. Because we recognize that our liberation is intimately bound up with everyone else's on this call, particularly our Indigenous relatives. And we know that we ain't free until they are. So I want to toss it to Krystal and to Nick to give some context for this film that you're about to see. And then we're going to get into today's really, really dope conversation. So Nick and Krystal, I want to toss it to y'all to give some context for the film.
Oh, that was the Indigenous woman look. You better speak up now. So I'll jump in there. Yeah, the little bit of the context of the video is, in the middle of the pandemic, in the middle of the uprising after the death of George Floyd, as you've seen the statues beginning to topple throughout this nation. President Trump decided to come into the heartland of the Osheti and come into the Black Hills and to come into Mount Rushmore in the middle of the pandemic against the will of tribal leaders. And as this national conversation was happening of how we're going to have a social or racial reckoning with our nation, we wanted to make sure that we as Indigenous people showed up in support for the Black liberation movement that was happening, but also to recenter the conversation about what reparations and healing would mean to us as Indigenous people, and to us that is about land back. And so this was a way to stand in collective liberation with what was happening in the world in a very Indigenous way, in one of the longest land struggles that has existed in the history of this country. And so this video is about the days building up to the action at Mount Rushmore, and the context of the issue, and how connected these issues are together. So that's kind of the background of the video. And of course, big shout out to Willie White, who is an Indigenous filmmaker who was on site that day and was a member of the NDN Collective team, but is also just an awesome filmmaker and artist and creative in his own right. And so big shout out to him and the team there, or NDN Collective creatives for creating this video.
Thanks, Nick. Let's roll it.
To our relatives of Bennington County, do you hear us inside of there? Our relatives inside of Bennington County, we wanted to remind you that you're not forgotten, that we love you, that we remember you, that we know that you're in there as a result of an unjust system. And us, we came together, your relative, to stand with you as we stand against the President of the United States, as we fight for our land. And we remember you, and we'll make prayers for you. So we're here to stand with everybody throughout this nation to call out white supremacy, to call out an end to systematic racism and oppression of our communities and our people. Tomorrow, the President of the United States will be coming to the heart of the Asheti, and he's not welcome here. And we're here to send a message that we want Mount Rushmore closed. and the return of that land back to the indigenous people. So we're here in solidarity and remembering that all throughout the system of injustice and white supremacy, you'll find indigenous people. And we also want to remind that as we do this work, we're standing in solidarity with our black brothers and sisters against this racist system of oppression. We have fought hard and long time to protect our land, and will not continue to stand for our land to be stolen from us and desecrated. So we stand at this time, at this moment in this history, and we continue on a struggle that our ancestors who have come before have fought for. Whose land? Whose land?
Your voice will not be silenced. We will walk upon Trump tomorrow. We say enough. We'll take back this stolen land, one rock at a time. If it's starting with Mount Rushmore, and it's not gonna end. It will never end as long as we have breath in our lungs, as long as we have blood in our bodies. We will keep marching. We will keep shouting. We will keep protesting. No, protecting. Because this is our land, and we're gonna take it back, and there's nothing they can do about it.
Our common enemy is white supremacy and systematic racism. We've seen what happened to our black brothers and sisters. We know that the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter stands with us as indigenous people as we collectively fight for our liberation, for the collective movement for our people. And our goal is not just to resist. Our goal is to radically transform this country so that it works for everybody.
This is sacred land. This is Lakota land. This is my land. I can stand right here.
The aggression today was come out from you guys.
We want our land back.
We ain't going nowhere. This is our land. It's been our land for thousands of years.
To the Benedict County Sheriff's Department, to the Highway Patrol, this is a warning to each and every one of you. You are unlawfully on our land without consent of our tribal leaders, in violation of our treaties. You have an opportunity now that we're giving you to stand down and vacate our land. Whose land? Our land! Whose land? Our land!
This is the land of the Oshetishakoi. And we're prepared to stand our ground. Today has been a proud day to be Lakota. Today has been a proud day to be indigenous. We shut down Mount Rushmore for 3 hours. And we did it in a good way. We felt that power from our ancestors. So Wopila Tonka and Chichiapalo to each and every one of you. Hands behind your back! Hands behind your back! Hands behind your back! I'm not doing it. For our people, for our Black Hills, right through here, for the Oshetishakoi.
All right, y'all, as we come back together, can we give it up one time for the NDN Collective, for the leadership of folks like those incredible warriors who stood in the street, not only fighting back against anti-Black racism, but very specifically standing in their ancestral calling, their inheritance, this long legacy of resistance to white supremacy, colonialism, and demanding what is rightfully theirs, man. If you don't feel fired up after seeing that video, I don't know what to tell you. It still chokes me up to see it. So now, you know, I get to introduce you to people like who not only, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of social movement leaders all across the globe, and particularly on Turtle Island, people who are our leaders, people who we learn from and with, folks who are principled and disciplined and rigorous in their fight for collective liberation, and for the liberation of Indigenous nations. Two people who I love with everything I've got. I want to tell you that you are among giants, and you are so blessed and highly favored to get to hear the personal stories and the political clarity of folks like Krystal Two Bulls and Nick Tilsen. I follow their leadership and feel really blessed to be able to ask them some questions that I want to know the answers to. And y'all get to listen to me talk to my friends. Are y'all ready for it? Oh, honey, I'm a missionary Baptist preacher's daughter. When I ask you a question, I expect an answer. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
All right, let's do this then. So let me tell you a little bit about Krystal Two Bulls. Krystal is the director of the Land Back campaign. Can you just wave at me if you've heard about Land Back? Just wave at me if you've heard about Land Back. Okay, a few of y'all, what's up, family? Good to see y'all. For those of you that have not yet, I'm proud that you'll get to know a little bit more about it today. Krystal is Oglala Lakota and Northern Cheyenne. She is from Lame Deer, Montana. Shout out to Montana. And Krystal's been doing this work for ages. She's done this work in terms of campaign development and management on local, national, and transnational campaigns for social, racial, and environmental justice. In fact, I feel like I met Krystal doing that EJ work. And she is a Native American veteran, right? So she knows about the fight against anti-militarization. She knows about fighting for Indigenous people's rights. She knows about fighting for environmental justice because it's our people's way of being in right relationship with our relative that is this planet. And she is committed to fighting for collective liberation in all of the ways. So y'all give it up one time for Krystal Two Bulls. I also want to introduce my brother in this work, a brother that, and similarly to Krystal, who's literally put his very life on the line for the sake of collective liberation and for the sake of Indigenous sovereignty. Nick is the president and CEO of NDN Collective, and y'all know that if they decided that was going to be the case, he must be a bad mother, right? Nick is incredible. He's also a citizen of the Oglala Lakota Nation, and he has nearly 2 decades worth of experience building place-based innovations that have the ability to inform systems change solutions around climate resiliency, around sustainable housing, and equitable community development, right? We didn't say that we were anti-community development. We just wanted to be community controlled, right? So he's been doing that work. He's been doing this work to fight and organize philanthropic interests, to support our people, and ultimately to dissolve themselves of the responsibility to choose charity over solidarity, to fight around social impact investment and capacity and advocacy infrastructure that's geared towards the collective power of Indigenous peoples and all peoples in that relationship. So give it up one time for the incredible, the illustrious Nick Tilsen. So good people, now that I have introduced them, and you have a general understanding of who these incredible people are, I want to tell you how this conversation is going to go, just so you know where we're headed. We're going to do some time traveling with Nick and Krystal today. That's where you get excited, because what you're going to get to hear is about what got us to the place of Land Back. You're going to hear about the past, right? We're going to talk about the current realities of the Land Back campaign. So you're going to get a little bit of the present and what you can do to support it. And then we're gonna dream. We're gonna forecast into the future about what will be possible once we get the land back, right? That's what we're gonna do today. So Nick and Krystal, let's jump in. Y'all ready? All right.
Right.
So let's go back. And before we get to land back, I just want to ask you what feels like a very Southern and very Black liberation movement question. Tell me who your people are. Like, who are you, and who are your people? Either of y'all can start, but if nobody talks, Krystal's gonna look at you, Nick.
I spoke once, so Krystal could jump in and go first.
Okay, I can go. Yeah, I can go. Epiveshev, everyone. Mene Wosta Nanehav. My name is Krystal Two Bulls, as you've heard, and I hope I'm half as badass as Ash's intro says I am. Appreciate that introduction. I'm calling in from Northern Cheyenne territory, and those are my peoples, right? I'm Oglala, so I always say that my mom's Oglala, my dad's Northern Cheyenne, so I have a motherland and a homeland, right? And all of that land is where my relationships are. But like my peoples, you know, there's that, right? Like who I'm from, who raised me, who invested in me, who mentored me, who guided me. And that's, you know, my family in South Dakota, and my family here in Montana and our relatives here. But also it's a lot of like movement folks too. You know, like I've been really fortunate to have been sought out circles where I was the youngest in those circles, and where I was the least experienced and the least knowledge, and put myself in those spaces. And so I'm really fortunate to call a lot of folks in those spaces, like my family too, and my people too. But I think like the most significant thing about like who my people are is really, and what brought me to land back, and I didn't even know, was that, you know, I remember my dad had told me a story recently about my grandma, and she had she was on her deathbed, right? She was gonna pass away within days, and she told him, go home, like light the sweat, feed the horses, and get the land back. And she was referring to like our community here, the Allotment Act, and it separated out our land bases. And so she was telling my dad, like there's land that we are stewards of because there's sacred sites on those lands, and there's burial grounds on those lands. And so she was telling my dad, you know, who's one of a council of 44 chiefs here for Northern Cheyenne, like take care of that land, because that holds our ancestors' remains, that holds our stories, that holds our memories. And so she was telling him that, like, get the land back. And I didn't even know that at the time. Like my dad just now shared that story again and brought it back up. Like that was maybe like 3 weeks ago or so. And I didn't know I was going to be in this position whenever that was going on. The other part is like, you know, I come from you know, a nation who was removed during Indian removal, and we were removed to Oklahoma, and they took us all the way down there, and we were dying of disease and starvation and different illnesses that were introduced to us. And my ancestors made the decision to go home, like come all the way back up to Montana or die trying. In the middle of winter, they were chased down by the cavalry and captured, and they tried to starve them into submission. In the middle of January, in a South Dakota winter, in Nebraska winter, they were held at Fort Robinson, and they still made that decision. They had just spent months marching and being chased across this land, and they got that far, and then they were starved, and then they still broke out of that barracks, and they still tried to return home to these lands here that we live on now. And because of that sacrifice, because they made those decisions and they knew that they would give their lives, like I get to be raised on this land here. And we have some of the highest water quality standards in the nation, some of the highest air quality standards in the nation. 99% of our reservation lands are still managed and owned by our own peoples, by Northern Cheyenne peoples. And that's really rare. And so those sacrifices that they gave up, you know, are literally what led me to this point here, to be able to say that I'm the director of the Land Back campaign. You know, it's like coming from those like deep rooted stories, like that is like the ultimate story of land back, of like what our ancestors were willing to do to reclaim that relationship and to come here to live and to be in relationship to this land. In the same way the trajectory of this conversation will go, like they seen we would be here right now. They seen their sacrifice would lead this conversation right here, right now. And so, you know, it's just an honor to be here. And that's a little bit about like my people, my story, what brought me here.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Crystal. Nick?
Who are my people? Love that question. I'd probably get in trouble if I didn't say it anyway. So yeah, so I got some strong family roots on my mother's side. Oglala Lakota. We're part of the Wahanchika Yape and the Iuhpe Tioshbais. Tioshbais is our clan structure here, we come from the Iuhpe Tioshbai, which is the same Tioshbai as Toshunki We'd Go, or Crazy Horse. And so there's been long resistance on that side of my family. My other side of the family comes from the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, who were Jewish social justice activists. And actually on that side of the family, whenever the American Indian movement was first getting started in the streets of Minneapolis, some of the very first things that the American Indian movement ever did was police the police. It was actually a page that they ripped out of the book of the Black Panther Party, and they started policing the police. And so the very first lawsuits ever filed on behalf of the American Indian movement were filed by my grandfather against the city of Minneapolis for police brutality against the Native population there. And then my mother's side of the family, you know, she was an organizer, part of the Oglala Civil Rights Organization that eventually invited the American Indian movement to come to Pine Ridge in 1973. That led to the occupation or the siege at Wounded Knee in 1973. And so that's where my parents met. They met at the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. And so, you know, that makes me an AIM baby. It makes me a movement child. And so I've been protesting in the streets and marching since I was a baby, in all the beauty and all the dysfunction that all is. And that's how I was raised up. And so, you know, very proud of both sides of that history. My great grandmother on my father's side of the family was Meridal LeSueur, who was a pretty prolific poet and women's rights activist and labor organizer. And so I sort of really grew up in those worlds. You know, the other thing that's a huge part of my identity is being a father of 4 wild Oglala kids. I got 2 boys and 2 girls that keep me on my toes. You thought building a movement was hard. Try being a father of teenagers. So that's a whole nother thing. So yeah, that's a big part of my orientation and who the people that I come from. And also, you know, similar to Krystal, I did have had opportunity to grow up generationally in this movement. And so I got to be around a lot of mentors and like a lot of folks who created space and it wasn't, we didn't just stumble upon this analysis of building collective liberation. It was sort of ingrained over decades that we're not free until we're all free. And so how we operationalize that, and that's what I'm excited about the conversation today. So it's a little bit about me and my folks and my people.
Thank you, Nick, for sharing. Thanks, Krystal, for sharing. As a Panther Cub, it's our inheritance to love each other. This isn't new work, so thank you all for bringing our people into the room. Before we fast forward all the way to present, though, I want to stay in this lane around like what led up to what you're doing, right? So I want to ask you, what sparked Indian Collective? What was that birthing process like? And why and what for, right? For the sake of what, the Indian Collective. And as you tell that story, start to bring us into what led up to the Land Back campaign. Like, what was the thing? And Krystal, you started us talking about sort of how personally your people brought you to Land Back, and Nick too. But like, what infrastructurally, as y'all were developing Indian Collective, led to this idea that like, no, we're actually gonna do it. We're gonna see it come to fruition in our lifetime. Take us through the thought processes, the local organizing, the national organizing, the international organizing that led to both the Indian Collective and the Land Back campaign.
Well, maybe I'll kick us off and start off the first part of that, and then Krystal can pick up on the Land Back piece of it. Indigenous people have been on the front lines of so many movements in this country, whether it be the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement, the racial equity movement, the human rights movements. But at the same time, as we've been on the front lines of so many of those movements, you know, you look at the conditions in which we organize in and the environment in which we organize in, you know, very, very, very similar conditions to our Black brothers and sisters. We live in the poorest communities. We live in the most isolated communities. Every indicator of the social determinants of health, you find the Black and Indigenous folks at the bottom of those things, whether it be economic, education, mobility, every aspect. The lowest life expectancy of anybody in America is Black and Indigenous young people. You know, you look at the incarceration rates, Black and Indigenous people are locked up at higher rates than anybody in America. So you look at all these indicators, and you look at the way in which we were organizing in conditions in which there's active erasure of Indigenous people. There's 26 states in the United States that don't teach any American Indian history at all, zero. The erasure of Indigenous people is active and persistent. And so, I came into this work really as a grassroots organizer. I started organizing when I was 17 years old, and have been organizing ever since, and spent the vast majority of all of that time organizing in my home community here on Pine Ridge, trying to change the conditions here. And this is one of the poorest places in the country. And we started creating, place-based solutions. We started saying, hey, if we don't grow our own food, build our own houses, revolutionize our own communities, nobody's going to show up to do it. We are the revolution, and it's here, And so the work leading up to this work was, a lot of us were becoming young parents in our early 20s, and we started creating some of these solutions. And I was a part of an organization called Thunder Valley that was doing place-based work here on Pine Ridge. And that model started being uplifted over time. What does it mean to go to the America's poorest communities and the poorest, most isolated places and build climate resilient communities that lead towards equity and solve systematic multi-sector problems? And so as that started to become successful, we started being reached out to by tribal nations throughout this country. And in a short period of time, we got reached out to by about 70 different Indigenous nations, and who wanted to do something similar that we were doing at Thunder Valley, but within the context of their own culture, climate, and spirit of their place. And the first thing I would always say was, well, first of all, we're barely pulling this shit off. So just to be honest, we're barely pulling this off. Secondly, we have very little capacity to help you, but we will share with you everything that we're trying to do. And so we found ourselves in that situation. And I think I started thinking about, how do you help? What does it take to launch this, to create broad reaching impact? At the same time that was happening, Standing Rock was happening, the uprising at Standing Rock was happening, and we played a very important role as on the ground organizers there. And of course, one of the things about, losing a battle is you always think about how you could have won that. What kind of infrastructure for our people could have been in place so that we could win, so we can start having more wins that we're tallying up as we're fighting for this. Because of the success of Thunder Valley, we also had these funders who were asking the big, I say the big S question. They're like, oh, the thing's working at Thunder Valley. Nick, you should scale. You should scale. And I was like, oh, hell no. I'm like, I ain't scaling. I'm going deeper into the community, But I found ourselves at this unique situation. And what I didn't like was that Thunder Valley was becoming this exception. Right? It was becoming this exception. Meanwhile, I looked all across Indian country, and it was, if you take away Indian gaming and you take away oil and gas in mining, and you take away extractive industry, there was almost no investment happening into the Indigenous peoples' communities or movements at all. And philanthropy, in all of its failures, it failed Indian country and failed our communities. And so I basically was like, all right, this is what it comes down to. It's not about scaling the model that we're doing at Thunder Valley. What it is about it's about changing the conditions in which Indigenous self-determination organizes and happens in our country and in our nation. And we entered into with a very simple theory of change that if you invest into the self-determination of Indigenous people that are doing the work of defending, developing, and decolonizing, that it works towards a more just and equitable world for all people and Mother Earth. And so it's not just good for Indigenous people, but what's good for Indigenous people is good for all people and Mother Earth. And that is the theory in which we built this thing on. And so NDN Collective, set out to say, we're going to challenge white supremacy in multiple fields, in the field of financing, in the field of philanthropy, in the field of organizing, in these different, and we're going to change the conditions in which our people organize and build power. And then we're going to, and through that process, we're going to amplify the voices of our people and stop the active erasure of Indigenous people by building power. And through that process, we're going to be able to build collective liberation and transform our communities. So those were like the premise for what built this. It was the NDN Collective grew out of the dirt and the roots on Pine Ridge. It didn't come from no, someplace far away from the problem. It came from us, the people with lived experience in doing this work. And that's where it came from. And, I think that always, as Indigenous people doing this work, we're trying to find meta narratives that encompass so much of the complex issues that impact our people. And that's what Land Back came about, and sort of the roots of Land Back. And also, if you look at the roots of any big meta narrative, it's almost always artists, culture bearers, storytellers that are the first ones to interpret what is about to happen or what is happening. And so, the early stages of Land Back, you started seeing Land Back art coming around about 8-9 years ago, and you started seeing it showed up in screen prints and t-shirts and different things. And then over time, organizers began to say, hey, that's a rallying cry. That's a war cry right there. Land Back is a war cry for a modern liberation movement. And so that is what led towards the work, sort of like the groundwork of NDN Collective, and why Land Back is so important, because it impacts multiple parts of the Indigenous Peoples movement. So I'll hand it over to Crystal to kind of expand more on Land Back itself, but that was a little bit about the background of the NDN Collective.
Yes. There's so much to share about what led up to this point. I think on a personal journey that like kind of feeds into me coming into Land Back is really looking at, like, I was raised by organizers, the same as Nick. Like, my parents are both community organizers and fought back against what would have been the largest coal mine in the lower 48 states here in southeastern Montana. And so we've successfully kept that coal mine or prevented that coal mine from being developed for the last 40 years. And so, I was raised by folks that do that kind of work. And then I joined the military and like on my own journey of like really healing from the trauma that comes from being in the military, not from what I experienced at war, but from what I experienced from the indoctrination and internally being a part of a system that is so destructive and violent. And so that was a huge thing. So I am an anti-war veteran, an anti-militarism veteran, and I hold that. And it's really it's one of the core things about my identity that I really use to translate skill sets to now really serve the people, right? So instead of serve your country in all the little lines that they give you, no, I'm taking those skill sets and I'm flipping those and I'm giving them back to the people so we can use that to actually do this work and move forward. And then just being in many, many different movement spaces. Sometimes I sit here and I think about the different cross movement spaces I've been a part of and the different tables I've sat at, and I'm just like, how did I even end up there? And some of them, it didn't even make sense in the moment. And I was just like, okay, well, I'm here now. I'm not sure why, but I'm here. So I'm gonna show up. I'm gonna be in solidarity. I'm gonna be a good relative, and we'll see how this goes. And I've been really fortunate to build really deep relationships with Palestinian organizers, and deep relationships with our Black relatives around Black liberation and reparations, and our relatives organizing around migrant justice, and even in the Hawaiian Kingdom, in Puerto Rico, in all of these occupied places, right? And so I've been really fortunate to be in a lot of these spaces and a lot of these tables, and all of it, even though some of it didn't make sense in the moment, culminated whenever I took on the role of the director of the Land Back campaign. It all makes sense now of why we need those relationships and why I was in those spaces, because I am calling upon and continuing to show up for each one of those spaces that I was in, and bringing those all together with me as we all push for land back, and how that impacts and connects with all of us in all of our struggles. And that really leads into land back. Like Nick said, land back was something that our artists and our visionaries radically imagined for our future, right? Like they are the ones that oftentimes see forward of what we can do and what is possible. And that's where, land back in terms of like social media and the hashtag and being like public came from, right? But the reality is, and Nick always says this, is that land back is something that lives within all Indigenous peoples. Every single one of us that was forcefully removed from our lands, like that is a fight that lives in us. And that is something that's handed down to us from generation to generation to generation, because, we've been fighting. We have been fighting since the first settler hit this land, and we've been trying to maintain our relationship with the land since then. And so this is really just a continuation of that. However, there are certain points that really drove in land back as like a campaign and as a movement and as a meta narrative. And those are all like, confusing words and like complicated movement words. But to like break it down a little bit is like, so there's the analysis around it, right? So we operate from the analysis that this nation was built on stolen land by stolen people, right? And those are the pillars that uphold white supremacy in this nation. And if we are really going to address anything and really get to the roots of anything, climate justice, racial justice, environmental justice, any of these, we have to go back to the roots of what this nation was founded on. And that is the stolen land and stolen people. And we have to look at that and address that. And so that is really what we operate from, and why we're so deeply invested in these relationships with our movement brothers and sisters and relatives, right? And so that's the analysis we move from. And that leads into like really the meta narrative that Nick was talking about, which is we really liken it to like Black Lives Matter, right? It's like this umbrella of a narrative that encompasses and is fueled and powered by people, right? The people and organizations and grassroots organizers and communities and individuals. Well, land back is a similar concept of this is an umbrella narrative that is able to house all of our individuals organizing, our grassroots communities, our fights for climate justice, for racial equity, for education equity, all of these things. Like we are fighting to reclaim like food systems and healthcare systems and education systems that are all rooted in the land. And land back as a meta narrative is a way for that to exist. And it's the movement that carries that meta narrative forward, right? It's all of these people. But what we decided with land back campaign, and Nick's always like, he's like always masterminding things, and he's always like scheming things. And so I know he was thinking about and envisioning a land back campaign before he even reached out to me for the July 3rd action. And I just didn't know about it. And so I know when I stepped into these things, he was already like visioning forward. But like, that's what trust in relationship building is, right? Is that when we call on our relatives and people to show up, like they show up for us. And when they call on us, like we show up for them. And so when Nick called me, he called me like literally like 2 days before the July 3rd action. I had no clue what I was getting myself into. But I knew it was going to be big and I knew it was going to be good. So I was like, all right, let me call some people. I'll be there. And so I literally at midnight that night called, one of the sisters from New York. She flew in the next day and I picked her up in South Dakota, and then we went, and that was the thing. And that's what led into the July 3rd action that you've seen. And so Nick and myself and 17 other land defenders were arrested on that day, taking a stand and bringing that narrative of land back to the forefront to say that there's more here. Like the conversation is deeper and we need to take it to that depth, right? But also we have to really acknowledge that the only reason in the momentum that built up to the July 3rd action was off of the momentum and the energy and the organizing of our Black relatives around George Floyd and his murder. And so what came with that was the tearing down of colonial statues that represent white supremacy all across the country, right? And so we took that and we've, historically that relationship has always been there. That's always been a thing. When you look at like the Black Panthers and you look at like AIM and you look at these relationships, there's always been that there. And so this was a continuation of that and like a modern iteration of this relationship. And so we were able to capitalize on that momentum that was built and that energy and that power, but also bring forth the narrative of Indigenous peoples, of land back, right? And so we took a stand there on that day, and and then afterwards we sat and we talked about like, dang, like what would it look like if we just did this thing? Like what would it look like if we revived this fight for the Black Hills? What would it look like if we shut down Mount Rushmore and we got rid of that colonial, like the ultimate shrine to white supremacy in the heart of our sacred lands? And so we really, started to vision and to ask those questions and think through that. And so then, Nick calls and asked if I would step away from the work I was currently doing and step into the role as director of Land Back Campaign. And, this is really just like a massive undertaking, but it is so spiritually led and guided, right? And I think that's a huge thing to also acknowledge in our organizing, is that this is very spiritually guided, and that had it not been my work and my team's work and Indian Collective's work, probably would have been at least 4 times as difficult as it is, right? Like the workload would have been insane. But we thought through a campaign. So the way the campaign manifested was like, we know that like we're not free until we're all free, right? And that we have to all, like, we have to fight on every front that we possibly can to win this stuff, right? And so we really thought about that, and our campaign kind of manifested into 2 parts of the like traditional campaign. Shutting down Mount Rushmore and reclaiming public lands in the Black Hills is the first part. And so that's something, there's a whole narrative strategy and tactic all around that. And then the second part was really around like movement support, and movement support, not just in terms of the land back movement, but our movement relatives that exist, in all these different spaces globally as well. And so we thought through that. And so the other part is like, we really focused on like, how do we connect these struggles? How do we amplify the struggles and amplify folks' voices? And how do we resource this movement and these struggles to make sure that we win, that we're not just organizing to organize, we're organizing to win. And we wanted to make sure that we set our communities and our movement partners up for wins, not to just be spinning our wheels. And so that's what the campaign is designed to do, is we do that. And then simultaneously, we're deepening our relationships with our movement brothers and sisters and relatives. And we're still holding that analysis, because we're pushing on people. What does land back and the right of return look like? What does land back and Black reparations look like? What does land back and Hawaiian Kingdom sovereignty look like? What does land back and anti-militarism look like? What does land back and like unoccupying Puerto Rico look like? All of these spaces, right? And the fact that we don't recognize colonial borders. So our brothers and sisters to the south and to the north, like, we don't recognize these borders. Like, those are our relatives, and we take care of our relatives. And so really just looking at like all of the things that land back is, it's massive and there's so much to it. And it is sometimes hard to explain, but it's also really guided and aligned. And so that's really what brought us to the campaign piece of this meta narrative and of this movement of land back. And that's what it lives within Indian Collective, an organization that is intentionally designed and built to uplift that and to support that. And that's a really powerful thing in a real way to impact decisions that affect our lives, right? And so that's a bit about Land Back campaign and Land Back.
Man, so I mean, before we get into the next question, I see some of you taking notes, and I just want to make sure you didn't miss some of the opportunities for you to celebrate along the way, because you might have missed it. So I just want to make the badassery obvious for you. just to remind you of some of the stuff that you just heard from Nick and Crystal. One is that we could have a whole nother series of panels on this question of scale, depth versus wideness, right? And what you're hearing is the NDN Collective is not missing one for the other. It's a false binary, comrades. Second thing that you heard is about like how rooted in cultural organizing, which is also our inheritance, this organization and this campaign, this movement around land back is, right? That art and culture plus faith and spirit will absolutely change policy and practice every time. That's what you're seeing. And this is both divinely inspired, multi-generational acts of solidarity. You saw in the chat, we were jamming out about like how from the first time that an enslaved African and indigenous folks got together to be like, fuck these colonialists, we've been about this work together, and that there was multiple manifestations generationally after that that have led to this moment where the movement for Black lives and the NDN Collective are comrades in struggle against the same oppressor. What you also heard, particularly from Crystal, is how and from Nick, is how multi-issue it all is, right? Indigenous people don't live single issue lives, neither do the comrades that they work with in collective liberation. So the campaign obviously then will have multiple implications, right? It'll have implications around climate. It will have implications around environment. It will have implications around decolonization. It'll have implications around what militarism doesn't look like, right? When we win, you'll see a difference in what sovereignty of nations can mean for peaceful relations. You'll see what reparations looks like. You'll see what migration could look like, et cetera, because of the victories of this campaign. If you aren't excited already, that's not even it, right? You heard that this isn't a new fight. You heard that there's analysis happening that's led to this campaign. You've heard that there's meta-narrative being developed that led to this campaign, that it was rooted in causation, not just treating symptoms, because we actually really do want to change material conditions. You heard that it is fueled by our people, their lived experiences, and that organizations are the vehicle by which that transformation comes about, that it's rooted in the land, but connected to multiple issues, that solidarity is the inheritance of our people to lead to this, that collective liberation is the goal, and that the way that we get to it is through a multi-tactical strategy that connects us, right? That the resources, the money is important, but the relationship is critical, right? That the connection is important, that the amplification of the work is important, and each other's struggles and our victories is important. And then again, I want to land it in the last thing that you heard, which essentially could have been the benediction, is that victory is ours. Our people have been winning, and this is just another manifestation to get us to further wins, right? So if you weren't excited already, I hope you caught those things, at least on the second time around. And I want you to just drop in the chat, if you're willing and able, how that makes you feel. How does that make you feel? Does it make you feel excited? Does it make you want to connect to it? Talk to me, and if you have questions, also feel free to drop them in the chat as we move into the next question. So we've talked about sort of how we got, who you are, how your people and how who you are has impacted the birth of the NDN Collective and the birth of this work around the Land Back campaign. But I want to get a little deeper in the now of it, both in terms of why now? Why is land back important right now? And you've talked a little bit to it, but I want to give some intentional space for y'all to dig a little deeper there. Why is it significant right now? And I think people could probably intellectually understand the why, right? I think y'all have already articulated that, but I want you to talk about how. You know, I think Crystal, you started that, but I want to get a little bit deeper about like how the NDN Collective does its work, how the Land Back campaign is doing its work, and why that is significant right now. Who are the people that are doing it, right? Give us a little bit more of that. Either of you can start.
Well, I can touch on the why now. I mean, I think social change, there's times of rapid social change that happen. It happens in arcs, right? If you study social change movements, if you're a student of social change and social justice movements, you know, things happen generationally, 100%. But in those times for things to happen generationally, there's periods of time in which there is catalytic moments. The 1960s and the 1970s were catalytic moments for the Black liberation movement, for the Indigenous Peoples movement, for anti-militarization movement, for multiple different movements. And in those moments, people start working collectively. People start working outside of their siloed areas because our liberation is inherently bound up, whether we want to accept it or not. It is, and that's why that happens. We're in one of those moments. So when we look back 50 years from now, we will be talking about what happened in the year 2000, 2001, 2000, 2020, 2021, 2023. We're actually in one of those arcs where there is rapid social change happening. There's rapid conversations happening. There's conversations that are happening that many of us, to be honest, many of us have been talking and using the analysis around white supremacy and dismantling white supremacy for decades. But we also sat in meetings for decades in which white folks got so offended every time that we brought that up. And now, all of a sudden, there's appetite for it. It's become more mainstream, and it's took the death of people. It's took the grave injustices of people and the rising up for that to happen. And so we have to recognize we're in one of these arcs, and that every organizer's dream is to extend these arcs for as long as freaking possible, because it will lead to change. Today, as Biden signs the stimulus into law, it represents the biggest investment the United States has ever made into Indigenous people in the history of this nation, ever. That's not a coincidence. That is not possible without a social justice movement, without a rising, because it's happened because we're in one of these arcs. It will be the time that we reflect. So I just wanted to say that right now, that's why it's so important. Like, why now is so important. And I think that in multiple movements, we also see that it's also time to break down silos within our movements and between movements. But that doesn't happen by saying that let's break down those silos. We have to build a pattern of practice. Collective liberation is not something that we only seek. Collective liberation is something that we have to actually build a culture of collective liberation, and over time. And so, I'll say that much on like why I think this time is now, and I think the apologetic nature. And I think that the reality is, like, we are coming for white supremacy. That shit is happening. We are dismantling institutions, whether they be in government, in philanthropy, in business, and around the world. Like, that shit isn't, we're in a time where it's active. It's not, hey, one day we're gonna dismantle white supremacy. We are active. We are in the time and history of active dismantling of white supremacy, and we're in it right now. Anyway, I could keep going, but the one thing I want to say about the how is, one of the purposes of how we structure ourselves as an organization, as NDN Collective, is we have different divisions of our organization, right? So we have a lending arm, we have a grant making arm, we have an organizing arm, we have a capacity building arm, and we have a narrative and communications arm of the collective. Because we recognize that if we're not going to only just say demands, we have to build mechanisms to create mechanisms to reclaim land and reclaim power. And so a big part of the how of this campaign is to resource through grant making. And one of the ways that we're doing that, quite frankly, is not just it's not through fundraising. The way that we think about it is we actually go to white-led institutions and philanthropy and say, we need you to give up your money and decision-making power to us so that we can resource our movements. That's how you can be an accomplice in dismantling white supremacy. So then we take those resources that we've gotten from these white-led institutions who've been participant in active dismantling, and then we resource the land back movement by resourcing frontline land back struggles around the country and around the world, along with resourcing our own campaign on the ground organizing work that we're doing. We're doing the same thing through lending and building the capacity of organizations and movements through training and amplification. So those are some of the hows. And if you think about it this way, Indian land back is a broad movement in which nobody controls. NDN Collective is a toolbox for that movement to utilize in their liberation, whether it be to build sustainable and affordable housing in communities on lands that have been reclaimed because of the movement, or whether it to be to create new energy systems that have been democratized and owned by the people instead of transnational corporations. We've created a structure to be able to do that, to operationalize the vision of land back. So those are some of the how, and I'll let Crystal expand on that, because I'm getting all fired up here. I got things to do. I got to get off so we can go get our land back.
Yeah, I'm getting fired up thinking about it too. I love these conversations, man. But I think the other thing too is looking at, like, I mean, exactly what Nick's talking about. This is a catalytic moment, right? This is a moment we have to be able to like continue to move from. And just looking at like the confirmation of Deb Haaland is a huge thing. The name changing, right, of the Washington team, of the different teams that continue to like name themselves after our peoples and continue to perpetuate that violence against us, right? So there's huge things happening, and that's why Land Back Now in this moment is such a thing. But also, like, I don't know, like there's something about this energy that's been building, and I think that we feel that, and sometimes you ride the energy and you just ride that out, or you go with that. But I think the biggest part about of like how we're doing that. So we have a list of 4 demands that are really broad and also specific. But the first one is dismantle white supremacy. Right? Like, we're saying we need to dismantle that. Like, we have to go all the way back to the roots and dismantle white supremacy at the roots, and in all of the systems and the institutions that uphold white supremacy. I mean, you heard Nick talk about dismantling white supremacy and philanthropy, right? Like, we're asking, like, give us the power to say what we need to do in our communities. Like, you don't tell us, what this funding is going to be for anymore. And so we're trying to dismantle that. And that's the work that we're doing. The other one is defund. So part of it is like defunding white supremacy is a huge thing, right? And like, in just how he was speaking to, this being the most that we've been invested in ever, that's a massive thing. And we're saying that we need to continue to defund, but mostly the mechanisms that enforce white supremacy, right? And so we're talking about the police, we're talking about the military industrial complex, we're talking about ICE, Border Patrol, and right down to park rangers, because as we know, national parks are systems that were created to keep Indigenous peoples away from their land, right? To keep us separated. So even those institutions are upholding white supremacy. And we're saying defund that, because what we put our money into and what we spend money on is a reflection of our values. And right now, this nation's values are in war, in violence, in destruction, in dispossession, in the removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands, not just here, but globally through US imperialism, right? And so we have to hold that as well and connect that back to defunding those systems and those mechanisms that enforce white supremacy. And then we're talking about return, like simply just straightforward. We are talking about what the literal meaning of land back is, like literally us reclaiming that land. And not in the same way that ownership is described in like a Western linear colonial way of thinking about it, but we're talking about the relationship and the caretaking responsibilities that we have to the land, knowing that she keeps us alive and she nourishes us, and we have a responsibility to like be reciprocal in that relationship. And so we're talking about reclaiming that relationship, which is also, yes, getting literal land back. That's what it means. And it's the reclamation of everything that was taken from us when we were removed from the land. Like I mentioned earlier, food systems, healthcare systems, education systems, those were all land-based for us before colonization. And so we're talking about reclaiming those things, and that directly feeds into like our languages, our ceremony, our spirituality, our daily ways of recognizing kinship in governing structures, right? And so that's what we're saying when we're saying return the land. And the last is consent. And so we're talking about moving us from an era of consultation, like meaningful consultation, which means nothing ultimately, and so we're talking about moving us from that to actual consent. So you don't make decisions about our lives and in our relationship to the land without us giving our consent about it. And that's what we're pushing for. So those are our 4 demands in terms of how we're doing this work and what we're really pushing forward. The other thing is that land back is really, it's our narrative framework, it's our organizing framework, and it's our political framework. So the other piece of that is really looking at like the political framework of this and looking at, political education and bringing our people with us with this understanding and this analysis, right? So us really deepening these conversations. We're getting ready to launch Land Back University, Land Back U. And that's going to be a place where we can really deepen these conversations about Puerto Rico, about Black liberation and reparations, about the Hawaiian Kingdom, about Palestine. And so that'll be a place where we can actually get folks signed up and invested deeper into these conversations, because if we know better, we do better. And so we have to bring that. And so we're holding that, and we're committed to that. And we're committed to our relatives, our movement relatives through the Land Back U too, to make sure that their voices are coming forward with ours. Anytime we get spotlight, we're going to bring you with us. And that's a commitment that we've made, and we're holding with that political framework. Around the organizing piece of it, we're in conversations about like, what do land trusts look like? What does land conservation look like? Just a perfect example is like the wildfires, right? That recently hit us hard. Well, Indigenous land management and wildfire management, those wouldn't have happened, if Indigenous peoples were able to actually have that relationship and that caretaking of those lands. It probably wouldn't have been a hit as hard, right? And so just really looking at those models of organizing and how folks are already doing that work, and how do we invest into that? And that's part of our work with the campaign, and the narrative strategy. Like my goal with our narrative strategy is like, I want to popularize and normalize land back. Like I want land back to be something that is just a household conversation. Like everyone in this nation and everywhere is talking about land back, so much to the point that like when we're having these conversations and we go to submit the Land Back Act to, for legislation, they already know it's coming. They know it's there, they understand it, it's not a fear-based thing, and they're ready to push it. And so we're really pushing hard for that, for folks to really take this narrative and push it out there, to not just Indigenous communities, not just movement communities, but everywhere. And so that's a huge piece too of how we're doing this work, is we're really trying to normalize the conversation of Indigenous peoples reclaiming land and reclaiming relationship to the land. And then there was the piece about like who's doing this work, and like Nick said, like this belongs to everybody. Like land back belongs to like all peoples that are moving for collective liberation, right? And there's so many ways for that to happen, so many ways, right? And I think that we're still developing out all the smaller pieces, but our grassroots communities, they're organizing right now. The Segorte Land Trust with Ohlone territories over in Oakland and San Francisco, they're organizing to reclaim land. We have the community of Oak Flat, which is probably one of the most significant land back organizing fronts right now. They basically, John McCain slipped a floater bill into the Defense Authorization Act that got passed, I think it's 2014. And basically gave an entire piece of sacred land to Apache people over to Rio Tinto and BHP, which is the 2 largest mining companies in the world and have a long track record of damaging and destroying Indigenous people's sacred sites. And so, they're organizing right now, and that's something that's like happening in real time. And so we're supporting them and uplifting their struggles. There's the folks outside of Santa Barbara, our Chumash relatives, who are currently fighting to prevent housing in mansions from being built on some of their sacred sites and their sacred land. They're preventing that. We got our relatives on the East Coast that are fighting just to like simply being acknowledged as Indigenous peoples, as original peoples of this land, in fighting to like get even just small pieces of land to have relationship with, right? And so this is happening everywhere. And then we have folks who are just trying to reclaim historical relationships to land too, who are trying to reclaim the ability to grow food, the ability to like harvest medicines, or the ability to hunt and not overhunt and overgraze these lands. And so land back is happening on so many different fronts across so many different communities, and not just Indigenous communities, right? And so I think it's something that everyone can own and everyone can take on and support, right? Like following leadership of Indigenous folks and in relationship with Indigenous folks. And so, you know, like who's doing this work? Everyone's doing this work. We just may not be always calling it land back, but that's ultimately kind of what it leads to. Because if we're trying to get at the roots of white supremacy, that's land back. So that's really, you know, who, how, and why it's so important in this moment.
So good, so good. So just want to remind you, just a couple of cool things that you heard that you might want to commit to memory is like, this isn't just about our values. It's not just a theory. The NDN Collective and this land back movement that is building is actually a pattern of practice. Like I'm about to use pattern of practice in every communication I ever say from here on out. That's brilliant, Nick. It's bigger than just our theories about what the world should be. It's bigger than just our values around how we should individually relate to each other. This is actually about practicing solidarity, right? That we need a united front to win it, and that land back in and of itself is a movement that is multi-sector, breaking down silos, belongs to everyone who is willing to follow the leadership and brilliance of Indigenous nations, right? That are actually at the forefront of this fight, right? And that they're not only implementing multi-tactical strategies to win this campaign and ultimately the other priorities of the NDN Collective, but they also are investing resources into people having multiple expertise to implement the multi-tactical strategy, right? They're not just building a toolbox full of hammers, because that actually doesn't build us anything, right? They're actually seeing it through. And then to Crystal's point, which will segue us into what I imagine will probably be the last question I get to ask the two of you. Let's move us into the future. Crystal, you say when people know better, they do better. And I definitely have seen that as a practice of the NDN Collective. Y'all practice what you preach around fighting anti-Blackness and white supremacy and solidarity with other folks, Black folks in particular, because that's my experience, but also Latinx folks, and Asian American folks. Like y'all have been such an incredible model, both domestically here in Turtle Island, but also globally, how to show up and show out in solidarity with your relatives in a way that doesn't dismiss the you know, we're not the same, right? So it doesn't dismiss the very specifics around the demands of Indigenous nations, which also are not monolithic, right? Y'all model that so well. So in this frame of know better, do better, what's the win? Like when the win comes, let's get us to the future. When the win happens, ultimately the multitude of wins that you all have described over a short amount of time together, what will the world be like? And why should people want to be down with that? The last thing that I want to squeeze into that question too is we have a lot of folks that didn't necessarily know about NDN Collective and land back before today's conversation with you two. So if I wanted to help build that future that you're envisioning, because especially because we've been talking about art and culture so much together on this call, like you all are also culture bearers. So if I wanted to get down, if I was just a homie of the Brooklyn Rail and I wanted to be down with NDN Collective, I wanted to be down with land back, I wanted to help build this future that y'all are about to articulate to us, how would I go about doing that? So tell me your vision for our future. Help me see it, make it plain, and tell me how I can support that future coming to fruition.
Crystal, you want to jump in? You want me to go? What are you thinking?
Either way, I'm good with either way.
Hey, I always say that you get too many Indians on a call, we have the Humboldt Olympics.
It's so true. Nick, go.
All right, here it go. The vision. Land back is something that the vision for it is that in order for lands to be returned to Indigenous hands, think about all the things that would have actually had to been dismantled for that to happen. The way in which the court system, the way in which the government manages or currently mismanages public lands, the healing that would have to happen between, indigenous, people and all people. This world of what land back is a world that's better for all of us, because it's lands being stewarded in a better way. Instead of our public lands just being, dumping grounds for pollution, playgrounds for transnational corporations. All of a sudden, these public lands are being stewarded and used to bring life to people. That when you think about the health epidemics that we have in society today, if we stop utilizing our public lands to line the pockets of transnational corporations, and we start using public lands to feed America, to feed our people in healthy ways, and we create jobs in feeding our own people. I mean, the vision for this is powerful. And I think for Indigenous people, we also see the reconnection to the land is a very spiritual thing too. And so you see languages that are so many, I think it's like something like every 27 minutes, an Indigenous language in this world is lost. And so you think about the revitalization movement to revitalize Indigenous languages, ceremonies, lifeways, because they're powerful to us Indigenous people, but they're also part of the cultural fabric that makes up this nation. You see the defunding of white supremacy. You start seeing things, instead of putting money into the military industrial complex and into over policing, you start putting more money in education. You start putting more money, instead of locking up our people, you free our people, and you turn those folks into active members of our society that are stewarding the land that we done got back. These are the visions that we see. You start to see, instead of transnational corporations contributing to climate change in unsustainable food systems, you start to see food systems that are localized. You start to see energy systems that are democratized. This is the vision in which we're fighting for, is local living economies in which people are living in peace, in harmony with one another. And this is what's possible when we get our land back. This is what's possible. And then you have a generation of people, both Indigenous and Black youth, who are currently committing suicide at higher rates than anybody in this country. Then all of a sudden they have something to live for. They have something to fight for. They see a world in which they are valued. They see a world that they want to be a part of. And they see a world that they recognize they are powerful facets of the very future that we're building. And that is the future and part of the vision of land back. You start to see things that are endangered species and endangered plants now become things that we celebrate and cherish and value. We start moving away from capitalistic economies and more economies that build community wealth and that level the playing field, because all of a sudden land is actually stewarded communally and not just used as a facet of capitalism. This is the inspirational part of the work, right? That's what the future looks like that we're building, and what it looks like when we get there. So I want to leave it up to Krystal, and I'll add at the end of ways in which you all can help be a part of making that dream a reality too.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Man, I get so pumped up. And like, like divesting from like corporations and military industrial complex, like just those two things alone free up so much funding that can funnel into our people and our communities for the things that we actually need. And I just plus one to everything Nick said. And I think like, even just thinking, like, I think about, we talk about these things with the Indian Collective as like, what's your land back vision or your land back dream, things like that. And like, I don't know, like, I just think sometimes it's so simple and so basic that like, if it was up to me, like, I wouldn't be doing this work. Like, I wouldn't choose this right? Like I would just be home on my own lands, my own territories. I would be learning my language. I would be like hearing the stories of my people and taking those in. I would be out drinking water that comes directly out of the earth because it's not contaminated by mining. I would be breathing the air into my lungs that is clean and that's not polluted. I would be able to grow a garden, and I'd be able to go out and harvest medicines that exist naturally on our lands and learn the power of that. And then I would be able to hunt for myself. I'd be able to bring in my own food sources and not be so dependent on these corporations and these food systems that don't serve the people. And I would be able to practice my ceremonies in my ways of culture and being in kinship, really reinvesting into the kinship of my peoples and my ancestors. And I would be engaged in my own governing system, like the governing systems that have existed since time immemorial, that like I'm really fortunate that my people still have. We have two governments that exist side by side. One is our traditional government, and one is the forced imposed IRA government. And so I would be investing in this, and I would be able to participate and engage in that. And so I think like that's my vision, is that like I would be able to just do that and just be home. I wouldn't have to travel nowhere else and fight these fights. Wouldn't have to be sitting on webinars all day long and on calls all day long doing this. I wouldn't have to be tired at the end of every single day because I've been fighting so that my kids and my kids' kids and all these kids in our communities that Nick's talking about, so that way they can have some sort of vision for the future, so that way they can see something worth living for. I would just be able to be and live fully in who I am right now, without any kind of oppression around me, without anyone having anything to say about that, and in relationship with how others are living their lives too, and with others that are also just trying to have that relationship and move forward like that too, and just be who they are fully in their power as like, spirit beings having human experiences, right? Like that's what my vision would be. It's like really simple and like very, very, I don't know, but it's what I see for my future is those things. And that's what I'm fighting for. And maybe I don't live for that future. Like maybe I don't live to like reap those benefits, but I guarantee you that our descendants will have that. Like they will see that and they will get to embody that and fully live into that power. And so, that's what we're fighting for. And that's what I see as our vision of the future of this work, right? Creating those systems, and even creating systems so we don't have to send our kids off to war. But what does it look like to create our own warrior societies in our communities to keep our people safe, that's based in our morals and our values, our culture, and our restorative justice lenses. And so that way they can be warriors and not have to go off to fight some crazy war that has nothing to do with us. And doesn't benefit us. And so, I'm invested in those systems and creating those things for ourselves and for us. And just how to support, like where to go. I mean, I would just direct people, and Nick might have a little bit more on this, but I'd just direct people to landback.org and indiancollective.org. And those are like the two places that you can get the most information about our campaigns, how to engage and what we're doing in all of our social medias, right? We're on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, hit up NDN Collective on all of those platforms. You'll be able to see all of the ins and outs of what we're doing on a daily basis.
Yeah, just to add to that, it is our collective responsibility to popularize the land back movement. And if you're part of the Brooklyn Rail, use your platform, use your connections to have the conversations. You don't have to have an Indian person every time in the room to talk about land back. This is something that that you can popularize. And so and also we need this movement needs to be resourced. So when you go to landback.org and indiancollective.org, like find the donation button, donate to that shit, because it's going to help fuel this work, and it's going to make that those resources are going to make it to the front line. When we have big pushes in media and popularizing, like take it upon yourself to champion the narrative of land back. Try to demythify it, make it less scary to your peers by not being afraid of it yourself. If you go to landback.org, you can see the demands. The Land Back Manifesto is dope. Like, take that manifesto, bring it to your kitchen table, read that shit at Passover, Thanksgiving, Easter. You know, that's what happens when movements are changed, is when you have political conversations, when our families come together, and utilize it that way. Have the conversation. What does Land Back mean to you? What do you think it means to Indigenous people? What do you think it means for this country? And remember the threads that we keep talking about. Land Back is not just something for Indigenous people ourselves. The theory is that when Indigenous people power is built and the land begins to be stewarded the right way and returned back to Indigenous people, and we work in collective liberation with our Black brothers and sisters, it's actually a better thing for all people. And champion that cause and champion that narrative by owning it, having being connected to your identity. Those are the things that people can do. Also, you know, there's a vast movement. If your family comes from wealth and your family comes and has acquired large amounts of land, like, connect to the local Indigenous people in that area. Think about what it means to return lands that you have acquired over time back into Indigenous hands. And it's not necessarily give them to NDN Collective, but give those lands back to the Indigenous people whose territory that is. That's what we're promoting too. So there's all kinds of ways to make this happen. Think about land trusts and who governs those land trusts. And so we're going to continue to put out toolkits of how to do this work, and how to keep the conversation going and how to keep amplifying it. And whenever you see Land Back come up in different spaces, because you'll start to see it come more into the mainstream, it's our collective responsibility to use those moments to have those conversations. So those are the things I would say of what people could do, because Land Back is something that lives and can live in the spirit of each and every one of us.
Y'all, can we give it up one time for Nick and Crystal? My goodness. Can we show them some love? Because I believe that could happen, right? It actually doesn't feel too complicated, right? Like, they've given us the vision, they've told us the why, they've given us the how. You know, in Highlander tradition, we don't believe that we come together to share this information, to create new knowledge together. That could only happen if people came together across their differences in sacred spaces like this. We don't believe just doing that for the sake of doing that, because smarter people do not necessarily a world save. But to Crystal's point, when you know better, you do better. And now we have more information about the NDN Collective, and we have more information about the Land Back campaign. We've identified and found our people that can lead us to this vision of a world where we don't have to do this shit no more, y'all. This is it. And now it's on you. So I know we're going to get into some Q&A space, but I just want to hit us with the last couple of things. You already heard, like, put your politics into your practice, right? And your money into where your values are. So cut a check, send a donation, follow my homies on social media, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter. They got an NDN Collective page on LinkedIn, y'all. There's no way that you should not know what's going on with the NDN Collective, because they everywhere. Follow them, amplify the work, have the hard conversations in the spaces that you're in, right? Whether there's Indigenous people there or not, and then figure out how you do that. How do you get into right relationship with these folks? And then, you know, just follow their model, man. These folks are so low ego, high impact. They could be like, no, Land Back is ours, and you have to get permission from us to even be anywhere in proximity to it. And instead, what they're giving you is the gift not only of their story, right? The good, bad, and the ugly of it. But they're giving you an opportunity to join a family, a collective of relatives that are saying, we're going to do something about it in our lifetime. And if we can't by some silly force that keeps us from it, that we will eventually be the ancestors of young people who not only don't have to do what we're having to do, but will be in right relationship with each other to sustain the win, right? And who wouldn't want to be a part of a world like that, building a world like that? So I want to thank Crystal and Nick, and I want to toss it back to the Brooklyn Rail to help us get through some of this Q&A. I appreciate y'all. Thank you, Nick, Crystal. I love y'all with everything I got.
Oh my goodness. That was such a beautiful way of rounding out this conversation. We have had a couple questions come in, but honestly, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and this event usually ends right about where we are now. So is everyone okay if we skip Q&A for today and move on to our two wonderful performances and close out? Does that feel okay? I just don't want to keep you here for another 45 minutes. And I feel like many of these questions have been answered already. Okay, so without further ado, at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our lunches with a poem, and one of the silver linings of this pandemic, though I kind of hesitate to say it that way, but one of the silver linings of the Zoom world is that since physical distance is less of a barrier, we get to invite actual living poets and musicians today to share their work with us. So today I have the pleasure and privilege of welcoming first Jordan Brien, also Mike Jordan, and then to follow today's poet laureate of this lunchtime, Ashia Ajani, to the stage. So give it up for Jordan Brien. He's the creative director at the NDN Collective. He's a citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of the Ojibwe tribe in North Dakota before receiving a degree in graphic communication and working on all kinds of interactive media. Jordan also spent years as a musician traveling Indian country under the name Mike Jordan, performing and speaking to Native youth. He currently resides in Grand Forks, North Dakota, with his wife and two darling girls. Give it up for Jordan Brien. All right, and Jordan, perfect.
Here we go. Bonjour, Minogishi God. Indigenous Jordan Brien, Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, creative designer for the NDN Collective. And as mentioned, prior to coming to the collective, I travel all across Indian country performing and speaking to our Native youth under the stage name of Mike Jordan. And I want to perform a song for you that I wrote in 2016. I wrote this song when Savannah Graywind LaFountain, an enrolled member of my tribe, went missing. If you're not aware of the story, there's countless stories out there. I want you to go out and do some research on this story. But Savannah Graywind LaFountain went missing. She went missing in the town that I was living in at the time of Fargo, North Dakota, and I was a part of the search party. And I didn't find her. Fortunately, I didn't find her. She was found. But as a father to a daughter, I don't think my spirit was strong enough. That I didn't find her. But one of the tools around that time in healing for me was writing music and reading to my daughter. And she grabbed a book, as she always does, and it was Little Red Riding Hood. We all know the story, right? Little Red Riding Hood. But have you read it from an indigenous lens, and especially around that time of what our relatives are going through and Savannah's family was going through? It hit me differently. So I decided to write a song about it. And, circling this all back to land back, there are those that extract Mother Earth. And while they do that, they also extract our women and our people in the process. And that story is about protection. And this song, The Wolves, is about protection, protecting those from the wolves, the bad people. And that's what the collective is. The Indian Collective is it's about protection. So I want you to think about that, as we're going through these webinars. I want you to think about protecting your own and protecting this land, Mother Earth. She gives so much to us, and it's important that we do that. And ask yourself the question too. This is what I'm fighting for. What is it that you're fighting for? You heard from Sister Crystal and Brother Nick, who I get the pleasure of working closely with, and we always get that question asked to us in our meetings, like, what does land back mean to you? And for me, land back means protection of Mother Earth. And all those things that happen when people take ownership of the land, they extract it. And they have man camps where these men are preying on our women and our relatives. So this song is called The Wolves. I want to say Chimagwech, thank you so much for opening this space for me to perform. And also just talk about something that's really important to me, something that we kind of forget about when we think about fighting for our land and liberation is fighting for all these other things too. But this is called The Wolves. Thank you all so much. It's all about, don't tell me Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, hands up, don't shoot, put your hands up and they still shoot. They don't care about you, they don't care about me. I'm not talking about police, talk about justice in these streets. What about all the things we need, even the water that we drink? Don't you take it away, including the land that we love, the people we trust, our mothers, sisters, daughters, even our sons. They still murdered all they missing, bring them back cause you're missing. They still after all the women cause they providing for a living. I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know you heard it all before. When they're knocking at the door, don't you let them in, don't you let them in. They just want you kids, they not suffering. They don't need your medicine, they don't need your government. They just need to play again. So stop it, no profits, tryna profit. We brought this, we got this. Teach them all along with the wolves on the wolves' clothes. We've been so when it gets cold, the wolves are out and it's time to go. So protect your own, cause you never know. I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Yeah, I know what it's all about, don't tell me now. Oh, don't tell me now. Don't tell me now. Don't tell me now. Hands up, don't shoot, put your hands up and they still shoot. Which, thank you so much.
Oh my God. Holy shit, look at you. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ashia Ajani, who will be following up Mike Jordan. Ashia is an environmental storyteller and educator, hailing from Denver, Colorado, Queen City of the Plains, and the unceded territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the Comanche peoples. As a Master's of Environmental Management at Yale School of the Environment, they seek to interrogate how historic and contemporary Blackness and indigeneity influence the environment and vice versa. Ashia, so thrilled to have you. Take it away. And everyone give it up for Ashia and Jordan.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I just want to say thank you to Jordan for such a compelling performance and a beautiful song. That was really amazing. And just this whole panel has just brought up so many important feelings for me as a young person who's growing up, as a young person who works with educating youth on environmental issues and primarily BIPOC youth, especially thinking about what their relationship is going to be to the land 10, 20, 30 years down the line, what we can do to make this a safe and receptive and reciprocal environment for them is so important to me. So I'm really thankful to Nick and Crystal for bringing up these really important points and these really important overlaps. This was such a wonderful way to spend the afternoon, and I learned so much, and I thank y'all for having me. This poem, I guess like a little background. So my mom's side of the family is Black Puerto Rican, and we also come from a sharecropping tradition in Mississippi. And this is a poem that just looks at what happens when you disavow people of their relationship to nature, and why it's so important to reify these connections, why land back is such an important movement, and why these intersections between Black and Indigenous liberation are so inextricably tied with one another. So thank y'all, and I hope you enjoy the poem. It's called God Save the Forest. I didn't intentionally spurn the forest. Rather, it became another question of Southern belonging I didn't have the patience to unravel. Must have been when the little white kids next door asked if we wanted to play cowboys and Indians, and all I could think about was the split in my conquered DNA that stood on both ends of the chastening rod. Or maybe when a man held a shotgun to the back of my mentor's head while we were out in the field, asked, "Whose land you think you on, boy?" Neither of ours. We just learned to love it because it was the only thing that granted us some semblance of peace. My mentor says he has encountered poisonous snakes in the Panamanian jungle, and this scared him less than doing research in the deep South. Snakes are usually more afraid of you than you are of them. Same goes for white folks, but Lord, how I prefer a fang to those trigger fingers. I didn't intentionally spurn the darkness until they claimed ownership of that which once sheltered us. When all that was hunt and run soaked my endings in bloodlust through this violent cat and mouse condition, the inherent trickery of my blood begged me to stay grounded when all I could imagine was flight. The voices in these woodlands are alive and they carry a vengeance. And maybe this is why white people fear the dark and what it holds. We marvel at its ability to hold, call it semantics, a cultural linguistic loophole, our right to something. My abuela weaves together sweet tales about the backwoods that were once hers. Long after the plantation manifestation made a mockery of her inheritance. The trees held their secrets with rope and flame, but I can't help but envision my abuela laughing, running not from any one thing, but towards the witching hour our foremothers once found refuge in. Mississippi is a graveyard of all my kin's wildest ambitions. We played pretended Americanness until it felt real enough to sink into, until it didn't defend us from the light, until the Superfund affliction reminded us of the well-earned savagery in our marrow. I flee from what my ancients trusted, and isn't that the most heart-wrenching betrayal of my blood? To deny myself access to the blackest parts of this earth. My great-great-great-grandmother's phantom footsteps litter the ground like dead leaves. And isn't that what this lineage always returns to? This ill-understood trauma of existing in between shadow and soul. Tell me, what is the difference between haunting and protecting a place? It's one of volition. The wounds down here are older than the flesh that displaced them, but the twilight reminds me that we could feel whole yet. Black people in the South breathe life into dark and call it home. Black as the soil that birthed bright cotton, this Mississippi Delta madness home, this wild, expansive Blackness home. Mississippi baby, on my good days, I imagine you soft and lazy, draped in all that green, all that darkness, all that unloved Black. Thank you so much for allowing me to close out the event. This was wonderful, and I hope to be working with y'all and seeing y'all in the future.
Thank you so much, Ashia, and thank you, Jordan. Oh, I froze. Did I freeze? My goodness.
Nope.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Ashia. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Ash, Crystal, Nick. And of course, thank you to all of you who tuned in today in the audience in the chat. This has really been so incredible. I really thought it would be incredible, but I couldn't have imagined just how phenomenal this is. So thank you for bringing us, such an important and beautiful perspective, thinking about how to resource people. I love this framework of thinking in terms of a pattern of practice, and also, to go straight to white-led philanthropic groups and organizations and offer them the chance to become accomplices, to hand over some of their funding. That was really powerful for me. We're celebrating the Rail's 20th anniversary this year. So as a nonprofit, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider making a donation first to the Land Back campaign, to the NDN Collective. I'll drop those links really shortly. And if you feel like making a donation to us and our organization, that would be a great help to keep our special projects free, relevant, and independent. And please join us again tomorrow when we'll be joined by artist Paul McCarthy in conversation with curator, educator, and Rail editor-at-large, Dan Cameron. And that will be, as always, at 1 p.m. in the Zoom. Other than that, you can now, I'm going to invite you all to turn on your mics and send off whatever felicitations you desire. But thank you so much. This was wild.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Crystal.
Thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
good feedback.
Thank you. Thank you, Ash-Lee.
Thank you all so much.
Very important. Thank you, Nick. That was very important. Talk.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I've dropped the links to the Indian Collective's fundraiser and donation portal in the chat, so if anyone wants to head that way, I strongly encourage you. But otherwise, let's break for lunch.
Yes, let's circulate all of that around so we can collectively be supportive of this amazing undertaking, okay? Much love, you guys, and courage from all the rest of us in Industry City here, the Real HQ. Ashley, thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, you guys. Thank you so much.